Welcome to HCD's Mindset. I'm Michelle Nigella.
And I'm Kathryn Ambrose.
We are on a mission to help you identify what consumer science innovations have a lot of untapped value or are too good to be true.
So join us for more curious conversations as we try to make sense of the complex but fascinating world of human behavior. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Mindset. We are so happy to have you here, and we're really excited to have our guest with us today, Kristin Shumaker. She is this wonderful researcher at the University of Pennsylvania that Michelle and I actually had the honor to meet prior to COVID, and we got to see her lab firsthand. So we really wanted to get
different ways. Yeah, so we get to visit your lab, and Kristen, you actually joined us for NeuroU and gave a presentation.
Yeah, a few years ago now. Yep.
Yeah.
So can you share a little bit about who you are? Because we're lucky enough to know you, but let's tell the audience.
Absolutely. So I am a PhD candidate at the Annenberg School for Communication at Penn, and I'm actually a member of the Communication Neuroscience Lab. So when you guys came to visit me, that I was showing you the system that I work with, but there are a whole bunch of people in our lab using lots of different methods to try to understand how people's brains respond during communication.
So awesome. I guess a good start is, what is communication neuroscience?
Sure, absolutely. So my advisor and the head of the Communication Neuroscience Lab, Emily Falk, she actually has been at the vanguard, along with several other people, of using neuroscience technologies to try to understand how people's brains respond to different kinds of messaging. So particularly public health messaging, sometimes it's political messaging, right? But what the brain can tell us about people's behaviors to different kinds of communications.
Very cool. And what are these tools that are in the lab?
So the majority of folks in the lab use fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, and that's something that at Penn we're lucky to have ample, resources for. But it's a big, expensive piece of equipment, an MRI machine. And the other thing that we have in the lab is an fNIRS machine, which is functional near-infrared spectroscopy. And in contrast to an MRI, the fNIRS is actually just set up on a little rolling cart that I can wheel around between rooms and use that to better understand people's brain activity when they're doing different kinds of tasks.
That's so awesome. And can you share a little bit more about how you ended up at this lab, how you got here? Because you do have a cool story.
It's what we call the origin story, right? So how did you get to be this superhero you are now?
So I basically just stuck my foot in the door and said, please take me.
That's okay. I did the same thing.
I ended up in the Communication Neuroscience Lab with Emily because I showed up at a conference in 2012. I was not in academia at the time. I was actually working professionally in the theater after having gotten a Master's of Fine Arts. And so I had been working for a theater company in California. I'd gotten interested in the neuroscience of audiences and neuroscience of communication. And so I just went to a conference in New York and introduced myself.
What conference was it?
It was the Social and Effective Neuroscience Society, SANS. Yeah.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, so I just, bought a plane ticket basically and found some people who worked with her who, went on to become great colleagues and just spent time talking with them. And eventually I was hired on as a lab manager for her lab. So I sort of got a foot in the door that way before I made the transition back into the PhD program.
How did you find her? Like where did you go from, performing on stage to knowing who is a leader in this communications neuroscience field? Like that's a big jump.
It is. So when I was working for the theater company, I was very lucky that, a lot of the theater work is nights and weekends. And so I was working full time for them and I had a lot of rehearsals and everything as well. But I also had time to do additional coursework. So I actually got connected with the local university up in Northern California, and took some psychology classes, took some neuroscience classes there. And I have a background in biology, and parents who were both librarians. So I'm an enormous nerd, and I know how to do literature research. And I just read papers. And honestly, it was from reading papers that I learned about her work.
That's incredible. I love that. And I do think that storytelling has such an integral role in your story and how you've come to be. How has that influenced the type of research that you do right now? What are you researching?
It's absolutely fundamental to it. I keep trying to shoehorn theater into what I'm doing, and it's not always a perfect fit, but I've learned that, you really have to break it down in research and take it very incrementally. So the research that I've been doing recently is on storytelling and interpersonal communication. That's sort of one area. And then I have another project that I've done on audience neuroscience. So for the interpersonal communication, I've looked at synchrony between individuals' brains. So in one study, it's between a storyteller and all the listeners who listen to her story. And then in a different study, it was synchrony within the brains of the audience members who listened to a story. So I've got those two perspectives on what synchrony looks like when people are listening to a story, and then different behavioral outcomes that synchrony is related to.
So interesting. And would you mind sharing a bit more? Which of the tools that you told us about earlier are you integrating into your research?
So because I'm interested in storytelling, right? It's a paradigm where people have to be able to speak. And it helps to be able to be in a really naturalistic setting to make people comfortable when they're telling stories. So I've leaned really heavily on fNIRS for all of my neuroimaging studies.
So why is that more naturalistic?
Well, instead of putting somebody inside, the magnet, inside the bore of a large magnet, right? I can just put a cap on their heads, and they can sit in a chair in, any kind of quiet room in front of a laptop and just record themselves telling a story. It's much easier and more comfortable for people.
Whenever I talk about fNIRS, I always say it's kind of that in between of EEG and fMRI, because it is something you wear on your head, but you are looking at structures, right?
Yes. And so actually, technically, it's a really good in between for EEG and fMRI as well, because we are measuring something that is very similar to fMRI, and that it's a blood oxygen level dependent measurement of brain activity, so the bold activity. And so we're looking at, blood oxygenation as a proxy for activity rather than electrical signals like you would look at in EEG.
That's really interesting. Yeah. And it looks pretty cool too. I mean, it's a lot more intense than the EEG system. I mean, EEG systems are getting smaller and smaller, right? They're like more flush against people's heads. And like, if you go to the commercial side, it's becoming, fewer electrodes. But I think when people think of like reading minds and putting gear on people's heads and neuroscience, I think they think of what fNIRS looks like.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to, when we visited Celeb, to put it on, and it is very intense. I'd have to dig up the photo, and if I'm brave enough, maybe I'll share it and Helen can put it up for us. But I joked that it was the most expensive hat I will ever wear.
How much are they running these days?
I don't have a good idea of price right now because our system is a few years old, but it's magnitudes less than MRI and probably a bit more expensive than EEG, some of the off-the-shelf EEG systems.
Right.
So again, in between, it's in the sort of hundreds of thousands rather than the millions of dollars range.
What is the learning curve on being able to use it? So, when you look at fMRI, there's a lot of medical sort of things you have to maybe know and understand. And there's a lot of transformations in the data that you're receiving. So when people, get the pictures from fMRI, they're getting these really beautiful 3D images of the brain and activity in it, but that's actually not what is spit out, right? Those are algorithms of numbers. So what are you getting when you get the data from the fNIRS?
lots of numbers. And so we have to do those algorithms and figure out what is, statistically significant, right? That's what we're always testing for. So, the learning curve is significant. As coming into this as a person with bench science experience, but no neuroscience experience, it was still a steep learning curve for me. And I think some of that is due to fNIRS being a much smaller community of researchers than MRI. fNIRS, I think, is the youngest of the neuroscience methods. So there was a paper put out a few years ago about sort of a 20-year retrospective of fNIRS. And I think they said 1993 was when it really sort of solidified.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's much younger. And that, it just, there's a lot of evidence for that like a best practices paper for conducting fNIRS research was published last year, 2021. And so I think my first fNIRS study I ran in 2015. And at that point, there was so much uncertainty about like, how do you design these studies? How do you do the data analysis? What are the best practices? How do you deal with noise? How do you deal with errors,
Which is already hard, even in the really well-established tools as well, that people still struggle with best practices and how to do things properly and get the results right. But when you're really out there floating alone, that's even more challenging. So did you have hiccups? Like, is this something that your advisor was already really familiar with, or were you really leading the pack there?
Yeah, this, I always think back to the day that I said yes. So she got an opportunity to get a pilot grant to do some fNIRS research, which was something that she, at the time, we hadn't done anything in fNIRS. And she said, look, if you want to do this pilot research, take this grant and do it, that's fine with me, but like, you have to be the expert. And I said yes. And sometimes I look back on that day and wonder why. But
when you're a grad student, you're like, you gung ho, right?
Oh yeah, totally. And and I recognize some of the benefits of it. But as far as the learning curve, again, because it's a small community, the people who are the physicists and researchers and engineers who are at the cutting edge of developing the technology and developing the analytical pipelines for the data are very open and willing to work with social scientists like me, who might not necessarily know all the physics or have all the engineering background, but we want to be really good end users. We want to be really conscientious about how we're using the technology.
And as people who are always discussing pitfalls of technology, what would you say are things that people should be cautious about? And, you like you said, that there was a learning curve to this. So what are things that you've learned along the way that are going to help you for your best practices?
Absolutely. I think you really have to understand what it is how the tasks that you're designing are going to impact the data that you're collecting. So my tasks are actually a little bit different, right? They're not like a block design task, sort of a standard form that you might use, but I'm asking people to do kind of open-ended audio recordings or open, very long listening sessions. And so in something like that, in those longer recordings, you can get a lot of drift in the data. And you have to also think about that the other challenge is not just in the design, but in the analysis. And, we're very fortunate now that there are good MATLAB packages and good other software options for people who don't have a huge amount of programming background or technical background to do data analysis. But it still can be really tricky. You have to sort of get in the guts of the data to really understand what you've got. It's not point and click. It's not even, with fMRI data, and it's been a while since I've done analysis with MRI, but they're well-established pipelines, right? Every lab has a pipeline that they put their data through, and it's validated, and lots of studies use it, and there are lots of knowledgeable people around you. And with fNIRS, it's a little bit like, oh, there's this new software. Should we try that out? But how does it handle this? And how does it handle that? And is this a valid method of interpolating the data? Or what do we do with artifacts? And so there are still papers being published that deal with those kinds of best practices. So it's, you have to keep on top of the literature, and you have to, listen to all of the engineers when they're talking about, like how to handle the data in a logical and responsible way.
And so with keeping on top of the data, have you seen pieces of literature or even maybe case studies from industry folks that got their hands on an fNIR that may have maybe misused it? And where do you think, where do you see the most misuse or, the most common mistake that takes place with a tool like this?
Yeah, I can't say that I've seen outright misuse in any published work. There are certainly lots of labs around the world using NIRS for different purposes other than communication. And, I think the other good thing about it being a small community and a young community is that we're really trying to be responsible. And so people are really interested in getting it right. They're not sort of just slapping a relatively, comparatively inexpensive technology onto participants and saying like, I'm just going to take this data and make it look pretty. Yeah. So I think it's possible that with the advent of more consumer side fNIRS products as opposed to academic fNIRS technology like hardware, that we may start to see more of that.
Right.
It's certainly the perception. So when I talk to people about what I do, people wonder, well, can you just like put it in a baseball cap and have people walk around the mall and like collect data from them that way? We're not there yet. And that when that becomes possible, then all the questions about misuse and responsible use will become even more important.
That makes sense.
And that makes a lot of sense. And we have talked, we talk about sort of the commercialization of neuroscience methodologies quite a bit. We just recently had a conversation with Anna Wexler, who's also at UPenn, and she does neuroscience ethics. And it's really about like consumer level, like do-it-yourself neuroscience. But a conversation that we had that is really interesting is how much money is being injected into neuroscience that is more on that commercial side. So when you think about Elon Musk with Neuralink, or you think, Kernel, right? So do you have any thoughts around some of these like really big tech industry people coming in to play around with these sort of tools and maybe that DIY neuroscience side?
I have to say my first exposure to neuroscience was while I was still working in theater. I was an early adopter. I don't know if you guys know it, of the emotive EEG system. Yeah. So I just bought one off the shelf when they were, they opened it up to people and said, if you want to buy one, there's like, a developer kit that goes with it. And I'm not a programmer, so I wasn't using that. But I wanted to try it out and see what the data recording was like and whether the data looked like it was good quality.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I'm not inherently against consumer neuroscience technology. But I think, I was just playing around with it. I wasn't trying to run studies with it. And at the time, they were really talking about it as for video game development, like they wanted it to be a different kind of video game controller. So it depends what the application is. If you're going to use it in gaming, or you're going to use it in like a VR, system or something with a VR system, that's different than if you're trying to use it in psychological research or, a clinical context, certainly.
There's certainly people who are interested also in just neurofeedback, right?
Yep.
How to calm yourself and things like that.
Right. Yeah. And I know there's a lot of EEG wearables out there for that. Yeah.
And so I know we spoke about this in our initial meeting, and I did want to touch on it because I know the collection of participants that you use to get in these studies has been discussed a little bit. And in our conversations, you mentioned that that fNIRS actually has been referred to once or twice as a racist technology. I was just curious if you would mind touching on your thoughts about that and almost explaining what that comment means, because to me, it sounds like they're almost personifying a technology, which is like very interesting, but I was curious your take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to acknowledge the limitations of a technology. And so the comment about fNIRS being racist, or that race really matters in fNIRS data collection, comes from this. So it is, whenever you're recruiting for neuroscience studies, there's always going to be criteria that your participants have to meet, right? Everything from not taking psychotropic medications to handedness, right? If we don't want any left-handed people. With fNIRS, the added complication is that because we're using near infrared light to make our measurements, and the sources of that light sit on top of the scalp, that you have to pass the photons of light through hair, through scalp, through all the layers underneath the scalp to the skull, between the skull and the layers between that and the cortex, right? So you've got all the submater, duramater, all those things, right? So you're passing light through tissue and bone.
Right.
And anything that gets between the light and the brain tissue is going to absorb photons, and it's going to reduce the accuracy or increase the noise in your measurements. And so I hesitate to outright say that people of certain races cannot be accurately measured with fNIRS. I don't think that's true. In fact, we know it's not. There is really good research looking at like neonatal brain development in rural African populations. It's related to nutrition. So there have been some global health studies conducted. I know that fNIRS has been used as a tool all over the world. It's been used in studies in the Middle East, studies in Japan. And you think, well, why does that matter? But one of the major difficulties in fNIRS signal and good data collection is dark hair. And so having dark hair is automatically more difficult than having white or blonde or gray hair.
So fNIRS is not alone in this.
Right.
So like even like, your Apple Watch, based on light-based technology. And so it's shining light, and it can be difficult if you have darker skin. And the same thing can be said for facial coating. Where people wearing glasses or having bangs or facial hair, but also just the algorithms are based on white faces, right? And each of these tools does, as you said, have a limitation, but it's important to acknowledge that and certainly do our best to try to and account for it. But it can be a limitation on who you apply it to, because we deal with this in using EEG in our studies, that we make sure people are right-handed. So you're missing the entire population, and then you have to wonder, does this really extrapolate that well?
Right. And there's certainly an argument to be made that if you are not as successful collecting data from people with darker hair or darker skin, that you're missing out on a section of the population that's a far more significant grouping than people who are left-handed, for lots of social and economic reasons, right? It's really important that we get a representative sample. And so the technology is improving, the actual instrumentation is improving so that you can, adjust signal and calibrate really effectively. I think that will continue to improve. And I think also just taking the time to set up participants without it being an undue burden. But if you can get the sources and detectors from an fNIRS system in really good contact with the scalp so that there's not a lot of interference, you can certainly record people, but that does make it a higher participant burden where your participants will have to sit there for a long time while you make sure everything has good contact.
Right. So another question for you. So here we are, we've been in 2 years of pandemic. The measures that you do involve getting very close to people. How has that gone?
I have not run an in-person study since the pandemic started. And for a good while, the university wasn't allowing human subjects research in person. You absolutely have to be standing right next to people. I often joke that I feel like I should have trained in hairdressing, because I'm always brushing people's hair and segmenting their hair and like poking around and fitting things on their head. And, you're very up close and personal. And so when it comes time that I'll be running a study again, if that happens, or when we in the lab resume fNIRS, we'll have to observe the sort of best practices at the time, whether that's masking or just hygiene or whatever we can do.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, do you have any thoughts about where you see this technology going in the future? I know so much has changed since even, since the original thing from the 1990s. Obviously, there's been growth since then. Where do you see it going?
Like a lot of technologies, I think everything's going to get smaller, more wearable, lighter in the sense that there's going to be less power consumption, wireless. certainly. And I think integrated with other kinds of systems is really close to on the horizon. So I think that there's a really great opportunity to integrate with VR systems. So I can see fNIRS being the sort of method of choice for that. If you're interested in like brain computer interfacing with VR. Yeah, I mean, like all things, I think that's the way it's going. And so there are going to be, as you said, a lot more consumer side technology there.
You're also wrapping up your grad career. So what are next steps for you? Do you have a defense lined up? Are you, applying for jobs? Like, what is it that you want to do coming out of this? What are you going to do with this research too?
Yeah, very good question. So, I mean, hopefully publication is on the horizon. My defense date is not set yet, but this should be my last semester. So I am starting to think about jobs.
And it's like, question ever. When is your defense? Like,
yeah, right. I don't know. Let me check my calendar or my committee. No, it's fine. It's fine. So it will be soon. And so to that end, I've been looking at what my options are. I decided pretty early on that I wanted to transition away from academia. So I'm not pursuing that role. I am interested in industry work. And so there's not a whole lot of industry work out there that utilizes, knowledge of fNIRS at this point.
I think that could be growing though, right? I mean, with the technology improving and the greater use of it being seen, we see application in our field all the time when it comes to, especially if you're talking communications testing and message testing. I think there's certainly something there.
Yeah. So, I mean, if an opportunity came up to continue using fNIRS, I would love to do that. I've also just looked at the behavioral science side, right? Because that's a large part of what I do too, is social and behavioral science. So I'm always looking at outcomes, and that's no different whether you're using fNIRS or not. So I've looked at UX research or also customer experience research as well.
Do you think it would be specifically with using fNIRS, or do you think it's really using the understanding that you have about how our brain functions with communications in general? That's really more the thing than the technology itself.
Yeah, absolutely. It's more than the specific method. Absolutely. So I'm hoping that my experience is going to help me generalize to different fields and to work in an industry setting.
Very cool.
Awesome. And I have one last question for you before we hop on into our game, but and I know that you do a lot of work, you've mentioned your interest in the dynamics between the audience and the people on stage performing or whatever that performance may be, if it's a video. Do you see fNIRS, and I know there's been publications about it, do you see it being useful for group dynamics and how so?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are already lots of studies that are simultaneously recording 2, 3, 4 people in sort of a small group setting. There have been studies done with like conversation analysis in groups. And that's it really ups the complexity, right, of your analysis. But it's absolutely something that I can see. And actually the kind of work that I have done with interpersonal synchrony is something that I think would be really useful to look at in a group context. And so I have not had the opportunity to record from a whole audience, but someday I think it will be possible, financially viable and just possible with the equipment to look at an audience of people while they're being exposed to a message, having an experience, looking at art.
That's awesome. Thinking back to your theater chops, is there any play in particular that you would hope would have a nice, group dynamic fNIRS study?
I often wonder. So the most visceral experience that I can recall was seeing a play by Euripides called The Trojan Women in translation. And it was back in the late 90s. I was a teenager. And it was so impactful that I still get chills thinking about it today. And I wonder what kind of brain activity I was exhibiting, and was it similar to those around me at the time that we were all sitting there in the dark theater?
That's really interesting. Cool. Yeah. Do you still dabble in theater?
No, unfortunately, the PhD is a whole time commitment. So it's been years since I have managed a show or worked on a show.
You ever want to go back?
Interesting question. I would love to go back to do research. I'm not sure that I would go back to continue working with artists, but you never know.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So, well, I guess we're going to put your performing chops to the test right now.
Oh no,
we're going to be playing.
I was never much of a performer, but go for it.
Well, this is free association, so there's no script. Whatever, first comes to your mind, that's what you're going to blurt out.
Sounds good.
All right. So I have the 10 words ready for you. Are you ready for the game to get started?
I am ready for the game. Bring it on.
Awesome. All right. So first word, communication.
Difficult.
fNIRS.
Light.
Representation.
Really challenging. That's 2 words. Sorry.
That's okay.
Storytelling.
Enlightening.
Human behavior.
Complex.
Audiences.
Wonderful.
Over-promising.
Always happening.
Neurotechnology.
The future.
Machine learning.
Also the future.
All right. And now we're up to the final word. Drum roll, please. Broadway plays.
COVID. Sadly, I hope the industry gets back up and running full steam. That's my first thing. Yeah.
Oh.
So true. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a really interesting conversation. We love talking to you about fNIRS. If people have questions for you, where can they find you? Where can they reach out?
The best place is probably on LinkedIn. I'm there. They can also find me on the Communication Neuroscience website from the Annenberg School at Penn.
Perfect.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for everyone listening. And without further
like, comment, subscribe, and visit us on all our social media platforms. We love having you on this journey.
For more information or updates, follow HCD Research on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at HCD Research Inc. and at HCD Neuroscience. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and be sure to rate, review, and follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you and stay tuned for more curious conversations.